Tokyo, August 15th, 1945. The morning light slips weakly through the shattered windows of the Imperial Palace. Dust hangs motionless in the air, drifting through a silence so heavy it feels sacred. Outside, the gardens are still. Not a single bird dares to sing. Inside a dim chamber, the Emperor of Japan stands before a microphone imported from America years before the war began. He wears a plain military uniform. No crown, no ceremony, only gravity. His eyes do not meet those of the men standing around. Him, aides, generals, guards, and all frozen, their white gloves trembling slightly at their sides. The recording begins. A low hum fills the room. Then a soft, deliberate voice, distant, almost fragile, speaks words no subject has ever heard from their living God. The voice does not say surrender. It speaks instead of enduring the unendurable. For a moment, no one breathes. When the final word fades, one of the guards lowers his head, tears sliding silently down his face. Even the divine had wept. The silence that followed marked not just the end of a war, but of an age. By early 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing like a burning house in slow motion. What had begun with lightning victories across the Pacific now lay buried beneath ashes and ruin. Tokyo, once a city of lantern light and imperial pride, had become an ocean of cinders. Entire neighborhoods vanished under the roar of American B-29 bombers. Each night the sky glowed red, and each morning civilians swept the remnants of their homes into neat piles of ash, a ritual of quiet endurance. Food had grown scarce. Trains no longer ran on schedule. Rice was replaced by millet, barley, and roots dug from gardens. Mothers traded kimonos for handfuls of grain. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded and the burned, while school children carried bamboo spears, drilled to defend an emperor they would never see. Japan's military, once feared across Asia, now fought on desperation alone. The Navy was crippled. Its proud carriers lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The army was trapped on far-flung islands, cut off and starving. Yet propaganda continued to promise victory, a final battle that would redeem the empire's honor. Inside the imperial palace, far removed from the charred ruins of the capital, Emperor Hirohito lived in near isolation. Few dared speak freely before him. His presence was still sacred, a living descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Yet, behind his composed face, the emperor had begun to see the truth his generals refused to utter. Japan's war was lost. The political heart of Tokyo was split in two. On one side stood the peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and a few senior statesmen who saw surrender as the only path to survival. On the other was the war faction, led by army hardliners who clung to the Bushido Code, the belief that death was preferable to dishonor. The divide reached the emperor's closest advisors. Meetings grew tense, voices low and strained. The word surrender was forbidden. Instead, they spoke of ending the war in a way compatible with national honor. But honor had become a fragile illusion, collapsing with every bombing raid. By March 1945, the American offensive reached new ferocity. General Curtis LeMay's B-29 firebombing campaign turned the night sky over Tokyo into a furnace. More than 100,000 people died in a single night. Wooden houses burned like paper, and rivers boiled. Survivors described the air itself as fire. Even hardened soldiers began to question how long Japan could endure. Meanwhile, Allied forces closed in from every direction. The Philippines had fallen. The U.S. Navy controlled the seas. British and Australian troops advanced in Southeast Asia, while the Soviet Union waited at Japan's northern border, silent, watchful, preparing to strike. At the center of it all stood Emperor Hirohito, the man who had never before intervened directly in military affairs. He was both the symbol of Japan's divine destiny and the prisoner of his own system. A monarch surrounded by men who spoke for him, who filtered what he heard, who decided in his name whether his people lived or died. Yet, as the spring of 1945 turned to summer, something began to shift. Reports reached the palace of unimaginable suffering, cities annihilated, civilians starving, entire families choosing suicide over surrender. The emperor's aides later recalled how his expression changed during briefings, still calm but deeply burdened. "We must find a way to stop this," he is said to have murmured softly. Still, the military clung to hope, or delusion. They prepared for Operation Ketsugo, the plan to defend the Japanese home islands at any cost. Millions of civilians were to be armed with bamboo spears and Molotov cocktails. The army believed that if they inflicted enough casualties, the Americans might agree to a negotiated peace. But by July 1945, the illusion was gone. Allied forces had captured Okinawa after a brutal 3-month battle that killed more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. The defeat brought the war to Japan's doorstep. Tokyo braced for invasion. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, or prompt and utter destruction. Tokyo's leaders debated it fiercely. The war faction insisted on rejection. The peace faction urged acceptance. The emperor listened, silent, as both sides argued before him. No decision came. Then, on August 6, 1945, the world changed. On the morning of August 6, 1945, at precisely 8:15 a.m., a single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared over the city of Hiroshima. In its belly rested a weapon unlike any used before, a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. A flash brighter than the sun split the sky. Within seconds, an entire city ceased to exist. More than 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would perish in the days that followed. Hiroshima, the city of students, factories, and wooden homes, was turned into a gray desert of twisted steel and silent shadows burned onto stone. When news reached Tokyo, disbelief filled the palace corridors. The army insisted it was an exaggerated report, perhaps a new type of incendiary bomb. Scientists within Japan's own nuclear research circles confirmed otherwise. This was something beyond comprehension. Even so, the war faction refused to yield. To them, surrender remained unthinkable. But 3 days later, on August 9th, another flash lit the sky, this time over Nagasaki. A second city erased, a second wound that Japan could not hide. The emperor's close advisor, Marquis Koichi Kido, later recalled the change in Hirohito's demeanor that day. "He looked into the distance for a long time," Kido said, and then quietly said, "We must end this war." But fate dealt one more blow that same day. In the early hours of August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Breaking its neutrality pact, the Red Army launched a massive invasion across Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army, once Japan's most elite force, in a matter of days. Tanks poured through the plains of Manchukuo. Soviet troops advanced toward Korea and northern Japan. Now, the Japanese Empire faced annihilation from all sides. That evening, the Supreme War Council met inside a bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. The air was suffocating, heavy with tension and exhaustion. For hours, 6 men, Japan's most powerful leaders, and argued over one question: surrender or fight to the death. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki pleaded for peace. Army Chief Anami Korichika demanded continued resistance. No consensus emerged. Then, in an act unprecedented in Japanese history, the emperor himself spoke. Breaking centuries of silence, he addressed his ministers directly. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer." His words, recalled by several present, carried the weight of finality. The room fell into stunned silence. The decision was made. Japan would surrender. But even this decision had to be made carefully. The emperor's voice would not be broadcast live. The risk of a military coup was real. Hardline officers still roamed the palace grounds, willing to die to prevent surrender. The announcement would instead be recorded in secret and broadcast later. This would become known as the Gyokuon Hoso, the Jewel Voice broadcast. Preparations began immediately. Engineers from NHK, Japan's national radio network, brought recording equipment into the palace. Technicians tested microphones under watchful eyes. Every step was carried out with absolute secrecy. Only a handful of men knew what was about to happen. On August 14th, the emperor entered a small room deep inside the palace. His uniform was immaculate, but his face betrayed exhaustion. The heat was unbearable. The air raid siren still wailed intermittently outside. He unfolded the written script, a text carefully crafted in classical Japanese, distant and poetic. It avoided direct mention of surrender, but expressed acceptance of the terms of the Allied powers. As the recording began, Hirohito's soft, steady voice filled the room. This war has lasted for nearly 4 years. He spoke slowly, measured, each word laced with sorrow. Those present, even the seasoned generals, bowed their heads, some trembling. When the final words faded, the technicians sealed the record discs and prepared them for broadcast the next day. That night, while the emperor rested, rebellion stirred within the palace walls. A group of young officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, launched a desperate coup to prevent the surrender from reaching the public. Their goal: destroy the recording and keep the war alive. Through the dark corridors of the palace, soldiers moved with rifles drawn. Lights flickered, phones were cut. For hours, the fate of Japan's surrender and the emperor's message hung in the balance. But by dawn, the coup had failed. Loyal officers restored control. The recording survived. The emperor's voice would be heard at noon. For the first time in history, the people of Japan would hear the sound of their God speaking to them, not to call for victory, but to accept defeat. Angle 1. The human angle across Japan in August 1945. The war had already hollowed out the spirit of its people. Cities lay in ruins, yet daily life went on in the rhythm of survival. Women queued for water beside cratered streets. Children searched for their fathers among the returning trains. Some came back maimed, others not at all. The sound of distant sirens had become part of life's background noise. In the countryside, families listened to rumors more than news. Few had radios, and newspapers printed what the government permitted. The common belief was that Japan still fought bravely, that the emperor would lead them to victory. Yet beneath that fragile faith lived a silent exhaustion. The night skies burned too often. The winds smelled of smoke and salt. Even the most devoted citizens began to whisper, "How much longer can this go on?" When the emperor's decision came, most did not know what it meant. The phrase accepting the terms of the Allies was unfamiliar, almost foreign. But they understood the trembling in his voice, the weight in his words. For millions, this was the first time hearing him at all. And when that voice spoke of enduring the unendurable, a strange stillness swept through the nation. Mothers wept quietly. Soldiers sank to their knees. Factories fell silent. Japan's defeat had not been shouted or decreed. It had been whispered, and that whisper carried more power than any gunfire. For many, the emotion was not just sorrow. It was confusion. The man they had been taught to worship as divine had spoken like a mortal, with the tone of a father mourning his children. In that moment, faith transformed into empathy. Within the Japanese military, the emperor's surrender was both a shock and a humiliation. Decades of indoctrination had forged the army into a machine of absolute obedience, not to the state, but to the emperor's sacred will. To surrender, even by his command, was to fracture the code that bound them. For officers like General Korichika Anami, the decision was unbearable. Anami had served the emperor with unwavering loyalty, yet the shame of defeat tore at his honor. On the morning of August 15th, hours before the broadcast, he took his own life, a final act of loyalty through death. His blood sealed a note that read only, "I ride with my death, humbly apologized to the emperor." Across the barracks of the nation, similar scenes unfolded. Young soldiers burned their regimental flags. Others knelt before portraits of the emperor, apologizing aloud for their failure. Some commanders gathered their men for one final address, urging them to serve Japan in peace as they had in war. Yet not all accepted peace. Pockets of resistance refused to obey the surrender order. In Manchuria, in China, even on small Pacific islands, scattered garrisons fought on, some unaware, others in denial. The notion that Japan's God had yielded was inconceivable to men who had sworn never to be captured alive. Still, the discipline that had sustained the military for years now guided it toward obedience. When Hirohito spoke, his voice, though faint and formal, carried the weight of divinity. The imperial rescript was not debated, it was received. And though many soldiers wept in disbelief, they sheathed their swords. The will of the emperor remained absolute, even in surrender. Inside the imperial palace, the night of August 14, 15 was one of whispered steps and sleepless eyes. Dingward ears moved cautiously through the long corridors, fearful of who might be listening. The coup attempt led by Major Hatanaka had shaken the very foundations of loyalty. For a few hours, no one was certain who controlled the palace, the loyalists or the rebels. The emperor's private secretary, Hiroshi Shimomura, later recalled how terrified the palace staff had been. The record of the emperor's voice, pressed into fragile wax discs, was hidden inside a safe, then moved between rooms to prevent discovery. When rebel officers stormed the broadcasting station and palace grounds, courtiers smuggled the recordings through back hallways, clutching them like relics. At dawn, after the coup collapsed, those same men stood in silence before the emperor. He spoke no anger, only relief. He asked if the broadcast could proceed as planned. They bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Majesty." When the noon hour arrived, Hirohito remained secluded. He would not be seen, only heard. The radio engineers at NHK placed the precious record onto the turntable. Static crackled across the airwaves. Then came the emperor's voice, soft, measured, almost otherworldly. In the palace, guards and attendants froze where they stood, listening to that sacred tone echo through the marble halls. The words were formal, wrapped in classical language few could fully understand. Yet everyone present felt their meaning. It was not just surrender, it was absolution. As the broadcast ended, a deep quiet filled the imperial court. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one by one the guards lowered their heads. Many had served all their lives believing their emperor to be divine. Now they realized divinity could weep. Angle 4. The enemy's view. For the Allied powers, Japan's surrender came not with parades or explosions, but with disbelief. When the coded message arrived on August 14th, confirming Tokyo's acceptance of the Potsdam terms, the war rooms in Washington, London, and Chongqing fell silent. Years of relentless fighting, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Iwo Jima, had ended with a few sentences transmitted over crackling radio lines. In Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman read the confirmation twice before speaking. "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor." Yet behind the triumph was a strange restraint. No Allied leader took satisfaction in the atomic bombings. Even within the U.S. military there was unease. General Eisenhower and Admiral Leahy had already questioned the necessity of such destruction, but strategic logic prevailed. The bomb had ended the war and saved what might have been millions of lives, both American and Japanese, had the invasion of the home islands proceeded. The Allied command in the Pacific, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began immediate preparations for occupation. Planes dropped leaflets across Japan announcing the terms disarmament, occupation, and the preservation of the emperor under Allied supervision. From afar, Allied soldiers and correspondents described the moment as surreal. "The war just stopped," one Marine in Okinawa wrote in his diary. "No gunfire, no cheers, and just silence and a strange kind of sadness." For many who had fought for years, the idea that Japan had truly surrendered felt impossible. They would not believe it until they heard the emperor's voice for themselves. The recording that carried the emperor's words, the jewel voice broadcast, was itself a miracle of survival. Tokyo in August 1945 was a city barely capable of transmitting a message, let alone a world-changing proclamation. The NHK radio network had been repeatedly bombed. Studios were damaged, transmission towers unstable. Power outages were constant. The engineers tasked with preserving the broadcast faced enormous obstacles. The record was cut onto 2 fragile phonograph discs, each containing one side of the speech. These were not metal records but soft lacquer, easily broken, easily warped. When the emperor finished speaking, the technicians sealed the discs in silk cloth and placed them in a safe inside the imperial palace. That night, as the coup unfolded, the discs became the target. Rebel soldiers searched rooms, smashing cabinets, demanding the location of the surrender record. Hiroshi Shimomura and a handful of palace staff risked their lives to protect it. They hid the recordings in a secret chamber beneath a pile of laundry, then moved them through a network of corridors to an office of the Imperial Household Ministry. By dawn, when loyal troops regained control, the discs were delivered to NHK headquarters under armed guard. Technicians there handled them like sacred relics. At precisely noon on August 15th, the transmission began. The sound that filled the nation was thin and distant, filtered through static and damaged cables. Yet across every village and city, people gathered around radios to hear it. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice, and despite the distortions, the message was unmistakable. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The words were formal, but the tone was human. In that fragile, quivering recording, the voice of a god met the limits of technology and became something universal. For centuries, Japan's emperor had existed beyond emotion, a living deity, distant and eternal. His image hung in schools and barracks, yet no one had ever heard his voice. His role was sacred, untouchable. But the Gyokuan Hoso changed that forever. When Hirohito spoke of enduring the unendurable, he was not commanding obedience. He was confessing sorrow. In doing so, he redefined the meaning of loyalty. No longer blind devotion to empire, but shared endurance as a people. For soldiers who had fought under the banner of divine conquest, the words were both release and revelation. It was not cowardice to survive, and it was now the emperor's will. This single shift in moral perspective allowed a nation to lay down its arms without losing its identity. Among the imperial guards, those who stood closest to him, the emotional impact was overwhelming. They had spent their lives protecting a man they believed beyond human weakness. But as they listened to his trembling voice, they saw something greater than divinity. They saw humanity. Some wept openly, others turned away, unable to reconcile what they felt. One guard later recalled, "It was the first time I understood what it meant to be Japanese. The Gyokuan Hoso was more than a surrender. It was the emperor's moral rebirth, and Japan's with him." Through that act, Hirohito preserved his throne, but more importantly, he preserved his people. By surrendering, he broke the cycle of death that threatened to consume Japan entirely. The night of August 14, 1945, descended upon Tokyo under a suffocating heat. The war had not yet officially ended, but something in the air had changed, a tension that felt like the pause before a storm. Inside the imperial palace, courtiers and technicians prepared for one of the most extraordinary acts in modern history, to record the voice of the Emperor of Japan. In a small chamber deep within the palace, a radio microphone stood on a low table. Around it, engineers from NHK adjusted cables and tested levels, their movements cautious, reverent. The Emperor entered quietly, accompanied by several high-ranking ministers. He wore a plain uniform, his cap under one arm. The men bowed deeply. No one spoke. The text of the imperial rescript on the termination of the war lay on the table before him, written in archaic, poetic Japanese, composed by court scholars and approved by the emperor himself. Its words were deliberate, steeped in centuries of imperial formality. It avoided the shameful word surrender, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Japan would accept the terms of the Allies. The clock neared midnight. The heat pressed in. Hirohito adjusted his glasses, inhaled once, and began to speak. The room fell utterly still. His voice was higher than expected, gentle, precise, carrying a faint tremor. This war has lasted for nearly 4 years. The words floated through the air, measured and serene even as the city outside lay broken in darkness. The men in the room felt as if time had stopped. It was the first time any of them had heard their emperor's voice unmediated by ceremony or distance. A few looked down to hide their tears. Others simply stared motionless, as if afraid even to breathe. When he reached the phrase, "We have resolved to pave the way for a great peace for all generations to come," the last wall of divine distance crumbled. For the first time in its history, Japan's divinity spoke as a man. When the final syllable faded, the engineers pressed the stop button. The emperor bowed slightly, then turned to leave. The recording, 2 fragile lacquer discs, was carefully sealed in cloth and placed inside a small safe. It was after midnight. Outside, the crickets sang in the palace gardens. But beyond the palace walls, the night was far from calm. In the city's darkened streets, a group of army officers were already in motion. They called themselves the Kyujo-ha, the palace faction. Led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, they believed the surrender to be treason. To them, peace was worse than defeat. It was the death of Japan's soul. They had sworn to prevent the broadcast at any cost. At around 1:30 a.m., Hatanaka and his men seized control of the Imperial Guards Division headquarters, convincing its commander to join their cause. Armed soldiers surrounded the palace gates. Telephones were cut. The city's communications began to fail. Inside, the courtiers were unaware of the danger at first. Then word spread, a coup was underway. Lights were doused. Papers were hidden. Loyal officers rushed to protect the emperor's quarters. Hatanaka's goal was clear: to find and destroy the recording before it could be aired. His men swept through the corridors, opening doors, shouting demands. Some of the emperor's staff were held at gunpoint. Others fled into the gardens. Meanwhile, the recordings, hidden by imperial household officials, were being moved from room to room, concealed beneath bundles of laundry and behind panels of tatami mats. At one point, the discs were stored inside a basket of linens in a maid's office, guarded by unarmed clerks who pretended ignorance when soldiers burst in. Every minute was a race against discovery. Outside the palace, the rebels stormed NHK headquarters, demanding access to the radio station. Engineers stalled them, claiming the equipment was damaged. In reality, loyal officers were preparing to secure the facility. By 3 a.m., Tokyo was a city of whispers and shadows. In the streets, gunfire echoed sporadically. The rebels tried to rally more support, but confusion reigned. Many officers refused to join, unwilling to act against the emperor himself. As dawn neared, the coup began to collapse under its own uncertainty. At 5 a.m., loyal troops surrounded the palace. Major Hatanaka pleaded with his superiors to continue the resistance, to fight for the emperor's true will. They refused. By 6 a.m., the rebellion was over. Hatanaka, realizing all was lost, rode his motorcycle through the empty streets of Tokyo. He stopped near the imperial palace gates, unrolled a banner calling for the protection of Japan's soul, and took his own life with his service pistol. In his pocket was a poem. "I have nothing to regret now that the emperor's heart is at peace." At exactly noon on August 15, 1945, the signal light at NHK's Tokyo broadcasting room flicked on. Across the shattered nation, from burned-out homes to makeshift barracks, millions of radios crackled to life. Static filled the air. Then a quiet, trembling voice began to speak. It was the voice of the Emperor of Japan. For most citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard it. The sound carried a strange, distant echo when as if it came from another world. It was formal, poetic, and archaic, woven with phrases that even educated listeners struggled to understand. Yet the message, though wrapped in ritual language, was unmistakable. Endure the unendurable, suffer what is insufferable. The emperor was telling his people to stop fighting. The war, the sacred war, was over. In cities reduced to ash, families huddled around radios. Farmers stood motionless in their fields. Soldiers in far-off garrisons pressed their ears against battered receivers. Everywhere, the same silence spread, the stunned quiet of a people hearing the unthinkable. In Tokyo, tears fell quietly in the NHK control room. The engineers who had protected the recording through the night now listened with bowed heads. For years, they had broadcast orders to fight, die, and never surrender. Now, from the same equipment, came the voice of surrender itself. In the palace, courtiers knelt on the floor listening from a single speaker. The emperor sat in silence, surrounded by aides and ministers. When his voice filled the room, even the guards standing outside the chamber lowered their eyes. Some wept openly, overwhelmed not by defeat, but by the unimaginable act of hearing their sovereign as a human being. Weary, compassionate, sorrowful, the words were indirect, never naming the bombings or the devastation outright, yet every sentence carried the weight of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of the millions who had perished across Asia and the Pacific. The emperor spoke of a war situation that has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a phrase that veiled disaster and dignity. He urged his people to preserve the structure of the state and the family, and to advance together for the future of the world. It was the language of a man trying to guide a wounded nation toward survival, not triumph. When the broadcast ended, the signal faded into static. For several long minutes no one moved. Then all across Japan, the emotions that had been suppressed for years broke free. In homes, mothers fell to their knees clutching photographs of sons who would never return. In the ruins of army barracks, soldiers wept silently, the weight of futility crashing upon them. Some tore their uniforms in grief. Others stared at the ground, unable to comprehend that everything they had fought for, the emperor's glory, the empire's destiny, had ended with his own words. In villages untouched by combat, farmers gathered in temples and shrines, praying for the souls of the dead. In schools, children looked up at teachers who could no longer find words. Even among the imperial guards, the most loyal and disciplined soldiers in Japan, emotion overcame duty. Eyewitnesses recalled seeing guardsmen sob uncontrollably as the broadcast echoed through palace corridors. Hardened officers who had fought from Shanghai to Saipan bowed their heads, their tears darkening the wooden floors. They had sworn to die for the emperor, and now the emperor himself had told them to live. Far beyond Japan's shores, the broadcast swept through the world in a wave of disbelief and relief. In Manila, American soldiers stared at their radios in stunned silence. In Guam, war correspondents scrambled to record the translation as it came through. In London, crowds cheered outside the Japanese embassy, their jubilation echoing through the city's streets. In Washington, President Harry Truman announced, "This is the day we have been waiting for since Pearl Harbor." But inside Japan, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. The sound of the emperor's voice seemed to close a chapter written in fire. In the hours after the broadcast, the imperial palace remained under tight guard. Some officers still refused to believe the news. Others contemplated suicide. In several regions, isolated army units vowed to keep fighting, convinced the surrender was false. But by nightfall, even they began to accept the inevitable. In Tokyo, the emperor's ministers drafted emergency orders to maintain order. The streets were eerily quiet. Citizens wandered aimlessly, carrying small radios or handwritten copies of the broadcast. The air smelled of dust, ash, and the faint sweetness of burned paper, the scent of a civilization at its breaking point. As the sun set, the imperial palace stood silhouetted against the orange glow of the horizon. Inside, Emperor Hirohito walked slowly through the silent halls. He passed the same chamber where he had spoken into the microphone just hours earlier. The lacquer discs had already been placed in the archives for preservation. He paused by a window overlooking the moat. Below, the faint sound of cicadas filled the humid night. The emperor, once a symbol of divinity, now seemed like a solitary man burdened by an impossible peace. For the first time in 2,000 years, Japan's sovereign had surrendered. And for the first time, his people had heard him not as a god, but as a voice trembling with the weight of humanity. The broadcast had lasted just over 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes had ended a world. The emperor's broadcast ended, but its echo did not. It spread outward from Tokyo like a tremor through a fractured land, reaching mountains, islands, and distant battlefields still unaware the war was over. Across the Japanese Empire, disbelief collided with despair. In China, tens of thousands of Japanese troops stood frozen in their forward positions. Commanders who had sworn to fight to the last waited for verification that the message was real. Some units received direct orders to lay down their arms. Others refused, convinced it was Allied propaganda. In Manchuria, chaos deepened. The Soviet army, having declared war on Japan only days earlier, was advancing with overwhelming speed. Entire Japanese divisions were being surrounded. Soldiers who tried to surrender were often captured in brutal conditions, their empire collapsing faster than news could travel. For those in the field, the emperor's voice came too late. On the islands of the Pacific, surrender unfolded unevenly. In Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, Japanese holdouts emerged cautiously from caves and jungles, hands trembling, faces gaunt. In New Guinea and Burma, some refused to believe the war had ended, continuing guerrilla resistance for months, even years. But in the heart of Japan, a more profound transformation began. Tokyo was a city of ashes. The fires from previous air raids had left vast districts reduced to blackened plains. Now, in the days following August 15th, the same streets filled with people, not in protest or anger, but in quiet bewilderment. Posters declaring the imperial rescript were pasted on walls. Newspapers printed the emperor's words in columns bordered by black mourning lines. The government, under Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, resigned within days. A new administration formed under Prince Higashikuni, tasked with implementing surrender and maintaining order. It was the first time in Japanese history that the emperor's government would operate under the control of a foreign power. In the barracks, military discipline began to dissolve. Some officers assembled their men to deliver the news, reading the rescript aloud with trembling voices. Others could not face the humiliation. They committed seppuku, convinced that honor demanded death rather than submission. Entire regiments held impromptu memorials for the dead, weeping as they lowered their regimental flags for the last time. In the Imperial Navy, ships anchored silently in bays and harbors. Sailors cleaned their decks, folded their banners, and awaited orders from the Allied command. In one account, a captain on the battleship Nagato gathered his crew and spoke only one line. "From this moment, the war is truly lost. Let us lose it with dignity." Meanwhile, in the United States, the news sparked celebrations of unparalleled scale. In Times Square, crowds filled the streets waving flags and kissing strangers. The image of a sailor embracing a nurse became an icon of the war's end. For the Allied world, VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, was the moment the global nightmare finally ended. But in Japan, there were no parades. Only silence and the slow dawning realization of what surrender meant. The Allied powers demanded unconditional control. Under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, Japan would be occupied, disarmed, and restructured. Its empire in Asia, from Korea to Taiwan to the Pacific Islands, would be dismantled. And at the center of that transformation would stand one man, General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. MacArthur's headquarters prepared for entry into Japan. The Japanese government, in turn, sent envoys to coordinate the surrender process. Every document, every procedure had to be exact. One mistake could reignite the war. In late August, Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew low over Tokyo, photographing the devastation. Where once had stood the world's largest industrial city now lay a landscape of rubble and ghosts. And yet, amid that ruin, the imperial palace still stood, scarred, but intact. Within its walls, Emperor Hirohito prepared to meet the representatives of the very enemy he had once denounced as inhuman. That meeting would mark the symbolic rebirth of Japan. As August drew to a close, the winds over Tokyo carried a strange stillness, neither the roar of bombers nor the cries of war, but the quiet anticipation of occupation. In that calm, Japan awaited the arrival of the conqueror who would reshape its destiny. On the morning of August 30th, 1945, the skies above Atsugi Airfield, southwest of Tokyo, filled with the deep drone of engines. From the horizon came a formation of American C-54 transports, silver aircraft marked with white stars. They descended onto the runway in perfect formation. When the first plane's door opened, General Douglas MacArthur stepped out, pipe in mouth, cap tilted back, his figure composed and steady. Behind him came staff officers, photographers, and soldiers of the U.S. 11th Airborne Division. It was the beginning of the occupation of Japan. Japanese officers, standing stiffly at attention, bowed deeply as MacArthur's boots touched their soil. For them, the moment was both humiliating and surreal. The conqueror had arrived without a shot fired. MacArthur's calm, almost casual demeanor carried a message. America had won not just the war, but the right to rebuild. The same afternoon, American convoys rolled toward Tokyo. The city, still scarred from firebombing, greeted them with eerie quiet. Civilians lined the streets watching in silence as jeeps and trucks passed. Some bowed deeply, others simply stared, eyes hollow from hunger and disbelief. Days later, a scene unfolded that would define Japan's surrender in the eyes of history. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japan's official surrender was signed. Representatives of the imperial government and military stepped forward one by one, their faces expressionless. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, walking with a cane, signed first for Japan. General Yoshijiro Umezu followed. Then MacArthur signed for the Allied powers, his pen steady as he declared, "These proceedings are closed." Around them stood admirals, generals and sailors representing the victors amid the United States, Britain, China, the Soviet Union, and others. Above the Missouri, hundreds of Allied aircraft roared past in formation, a thunderous reminder of the power that had brought the empire to its knees. Below deck, Japanese officers bowed deeply, their surrender now irreversible. At 9:08 a.m., the war that had consumed the world for 6 years officially ended. In the weeks that followed, Japan ceased to be an empire and became an occupied nation. American troops filled the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, headquartered in the Daiichi building across from the Imperial Palace, became the new center of authority. Food shortages were severe. Cities were in ruins. Millions of demobilized soldiers returned home to nothing. No jobs, no families, no homes. Refugees from the former colonies flooded back by the millions, their ships packed with the displaced and the broken. And yet, amid the despair, something began to shift. On September 27, 1945, Emperor Hirohito entered the Daiichi building to meet General MacArthur face to face. No cameras were allowed during the initial greeting. Only later did the famous photograph emerge. Hirohito, small and stiff in a morning coat, standing beside the tall, relaxed MacArthur in an open shirt and khaki trousers. To the Japanese, it was a shocking image, their divine ruler dwarfed by the conqueror who treated him as an equal. To Americans, it symbolized victory and reconciliation. The meeting lasted 35 minutes. No transcript was kept, but witnesses said the emperor accepted full responsibility for Japan's actions during the war. MacArthur in turn decided that the emperor should remain on the throne, not as a god but as a symbol. That decision would shape Japan's future. Under Allied supervision, sweeping reforms began. The military was dissolved. The secret police were disbanded. War criminals were arrested and sent to trial before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Factories once dedicated to tanks and aircraft were converted to civilian production. Newspapers were freed from censorship for the first time in decades. In 1946, a new constitution was drafted, one that renounced war as a national right. Article 9 declared, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation." The emperor's role was redefined. No longer divine, he became the symbol of the state and the unity of the people. It was the quiet end of an ancient order and the birth of a new Japan. Yet even as Reconstruction began, the emotional wounds of defeat ran deep. Families mourned the lost. Entire generations carried the shame of surrender like a shadow. And for the emperor himself, the memory of that August day, the broadcast, the tears, the silence, would never fade. He had spoken once to end a war. Now he would spend the rest of his life trying to preserve the peace that followed. From the ashes of empire, a fragile democracy was taking shape, one born from surrender, but guided by survival. And in the silence that followed August 15, 1945, Japan stood at the edge of a new existence. The cities were gone, the army disbanded, the empire dissolved. But out of the ruins, a nation began to rediscover what it meant to live. Not to fight, not to conquer, but to endure. The emperor's broadcast had not simply ended a war, it had broken a centuries-old illusion. For generations, the Japanese people had been taught that their ruler was divine, a living descendant of the sun goddess, beyond human frailty. Yet when his voice trembled across the airwaves, it was not the voice of a god but of a man, weary, sorrowful, and resolute. In that moment, divinity gave way to humanity. And through that humanity, Japan found a path to survival. The tears that fell in the palace halls, in barracks, and in burned-out homes were not only for defeat, they were for the death of an age, the end of a vision built on obedience, sacrifice, and unquestioned faith. The emperor had chosen to live not as a symbol of conquest, but as a symbol of endurance. That choice, fragile, unprecedented, and deeply human, allowed a shattered people to begin again. When Emperor Hirohito later walked among his people, visiting cities reduced to rubble, the crowds no longer saw a distant deity. They saw a man walking through the same dust, breathing the same air, carrying the same weight of loss. In that shared vulnerability, the first seed of post-war Japan was planted. Over the following years, the nation would rise from its ashes, not through power, but through perseverance. The factories rebuilt, the schools reopened, and a generation that had grown up under banners of war began building a future defined by peace. Article 9 of the new Constitution, once a symbol of defeat, became the moral foundation of a country determined never to return to war. The voice that once commanded an empire had spoken only once to surrender it. And in doing so, it gave birth to a new Japan, a Japan that learned the strength of humility, the courage of peace, and the quiet power of endurance. Center stood the man whose voice had changed the course of history,